Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. If you care about ending gun violence, you should care about reproductive justice, co-hosted by If, When, How and the National Women's Law Center. My name is Yumhee Park, and I'm the Engagement and Mobilization Associate at the National Women's Law Center and today's moderator. We have a few technical notes before we begin the presentation. First, all lines will be on mute during today's webinar. Second, we will be taking questions after our experts are finished with the presentation, but we encourage you to submit questions throughout the webinar. You can submit a question by typing it using the chat function. Finally, we will be recording today's webinar, and you will receive a link to a recording of the presentation, as well as a link to the PowerPoint slides and all related resources within the next few days. At this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to Kelly Garcia, Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center.
Thank you, Yamhee, and welcome to everyone for our third and final webinar of 2016. We are very excited for this webinar, co-sponsored with If, When, How. Before we get started, I do want to note that the views expressed in this webinar are those of the speakers and do not reflect the views or positions of If, When, How or the National Women's Law Center. I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we do find ourselves today in a vastly different landscape than we had really expected. And the National Women's Law Center is still here, and we haven't gone anywhere, and we are going to continue to fight for women and girls. And I want to make clear that we are excited for next year, and we're excited to kind of roll our sleeves up and start getting the work done. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lena Houston from If, When, How.
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. My name is Lena Houston, and I'm the Director of Campus and Community Programs at the National Office of If, When, How. As Kelly said, this is the third and final webinar in our 7th annual series. We're really excited to be working together again, and we are so glad that you have taken time out of your schedule to join us today. In case this is the first time you're tuning into this webinar series, or if you may not be familiar with If, When, How, we are a national organization focused on training and mobilizing law students and legal professionals across the country to foster legal expertise and support for the realization of reproductive justice. We work with over 100 chapters on law school campuses across the country, our Rockstar Reproductive Justice Federal Fellows in Washington, D.C., State Fellows in Seattle and Pittsburgh, and HIV Fellows in Atlanta and Oakland, and of course our robust community of alums and legal professionals. You may have known us by a different name. This past summer we went from Law Students for Reproductive Justice to If, When, How. Our new tagline, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice, helps explain why. After more than a decade of supporting students to become stronger champions of reproductive justice in law school, If, When, How is expanding its focus to engage law students and legal professionals. We know that you don't stop caring about reproductive justice once you've graduated, so we wanted to be explicit about the training, networking, and advocacy opportunities we provide that will help put your passion and skills to work for reproductive justice throughout your career. If, When, How also changed its name to make sure our mission was heard loud and clear, to fight to ensure all people can decide if, when, and how to create and sustain families with dignity, free from discrimination, coercion, or violence. On behalf of If, When, How, I want to give a big thank you to the National Women's Law Center, particularly to Kelly and Yumhee, as well as to our presenters for bringing their expertise to this webinar. And again, thank you all for your interest in reproductive justice, and I turn it back to you, Kelly.
Thank you, Lena. Today, before we get started and I turn it over to our wonderful speakers, I just want to briefly talk about this webinar series and the reproductive justice movement more broadly. So first off, we really planned and thought about when we started planning for this webinar series 7 years ago, we wanted to make sure that we were bringing other social justice movements to the reproductive justice movement, and in turn introducing people who might not know or think about their work and how the social justice movements they are working for are related to and overlap with reproductive justice. And so with that in mind, we designed our If You Really Care About series. And this year we have had 3 webinars. The first one focusing on ending pregnancy discrimination. The second one talked about immigration, and now we're doing gun violence. But just because we're wrapping up this year doesn't mean that we aren't looking ahead towards next year, and we do almost immediately start thinking about what topics are going to make sense and what topics people would like to hear about. So if you have topics that you want to hear from, things that we missed this year, please reach out to either Lena or me. We love to hear from you, and we want to think about planning a webinar series that's really enjoyable and useful for everyone. And I do want to take a moment to talk about the reproductive justice movement. So the reproductive justice movement was created as a response to movements that had really failed to meet the needs of communities of color. It was a response to the fact that women of color, low-income women, and younger women were often as likely, if not more likely, to face resistance to their childbearing and child-rearing as they were to have trouble accessing contraception and abortion. And so it recognizes that full reproductive freedom requires addressing all forms of inequality, that it requires addressing the social inequities that keep people from being able to make decisions about when, whether, and to have children with dignity and autonomy. And so there are 3 main components that we think about when we think, there are 3 main components we often think about when we talk about reproductive justice. And that's really the right to have children, the right to have the children you want, the right to raise the children that you have, and the ability to plan your families through safe, legal access to abortion and contraception. And so the RJ lens is really broader than the liberty and autonomy lenses we often think about with traditional rights-based movements. RJ recognizes that the focus on control and exploitation of women's bodies through restrictive laws and lack of protections are means of controlling women and communities, and particularly women of color. And it also recognizes the need to have communities that are safe and free from violence, and the need for governments to take proactive steps to ensure the components that are necessary for people to have true ability to make these decisions about whether and when to have children. And with that brief introduction, I want to turn it over to Andrea Johnson, who is our Equal Justice Works Fellow at the National Women's Law Center.
Thanks so much, Kelly. So I was super excited when I learned that we were putting together this webinar because I am the daughter of a survivor of gun violence. My father was shot by a classmate in the 1970s when he was a grad student in Texas. The classmate was upset about a grade he had received, and he walked into the classroom and opened fire, shooting the professor and shooting my father in the shoulder. My father survived, but his life was and still is deeply affected by that traumatic, violent experience, as is mine. Gun violence is a real threat to reproductive justice. Reproductive justice requires that people be able to live and raise their families in safe, healthy communities and make decisions about their lives and futures with dignity and autonomy. But the threat of gun violence makes this impossible for so many people. I know that the trauma my father has lived with from being shot impacted my childhood and how he raised me. My dad did not want me playing at friends' houses if their parents owned any type of gun. He didn't want me watching TV shows with guns, and he didn't want me playing with toy guns because he didn't want to normalize gun violence. While my father's trauma is real, I grew up as a white kid in small-town Minnesota. The fear my family felt did not carry the same urgency or pervade and disrupt and dictate our lives in the way gun violence undermines the ability of many people of color to live and raise their families. As a movement rooted in social justice and founded by women of color, the reproductive justice movement recognizes the significant harms of gun violence, particularly for people of color. Sadly, we live in a society that too often views people of color and Black and Latino young people in particular as a threat. This has dangerous consequences in an armed society. Reproductive justice must advance policies that address the causes of gun violence and support viable solutions to ensure that people in all communities can live and raise their families in safe environments. I am very honored to now introduce our two speakers who are wonderful people who are doing just that work. We will first hear from Kathleen Romig-Krebs. Kathleen started marching against gun violence as a child in Detroit. She is a working mom with 2 young sons. She is also the volunteer spokesperson for the DC chapter of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, which was founded in 2012 in response to the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School. The organization has chapters in all 50 states and a powerful grassroots network of moms that has successfully affected change at the local, state, and national level. Our second speaker is Dion McGill. Dion is a program manager for the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, or ICHV. Founded in 1975, ICHV is the oldest and largest statewide organization in the U.S., working to prevent the devastation caused by firearms by educating, raising public awareness, and building coalitions to enact change in laws and behavior. Dion teaches the ICHV's Activist Institute program, which instructs Illinois youth on methods of advocacy and activism that they can use in their communities. Dion is a licensed Illinois state educator as well as a U.S. Army veteran. We are super honored to have them both here to share their expertise, so I will turn it over now to Kathleen.
Wonderful, thank you. All right. Sorry, are my slides showing up or not?
Yes, they are.
Oh, great, thank you. All right. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And sorry, you know what, I just don't see my slides. I'm so sorry. Okay. Well, as long as you're seeing them fine, I would just go ahead. So as Andrea mentioned, Moms Demand Action is a grassroots gun violence prevention group with more than 3 million members all over the country. Just one second, I'm so sorry, I'm just going to mute here. We are not just moms, but dads, teachers, doctors, students, law enforcement, healthcare professionals, anyone with an interest in preventing gun violence. And our movement is very diverse. We, especially since the Pulse nightclub shooting, we have a very diverse membership of many LGBT allies. It's a racially diverse and geographically diverse movement. We also have a very powerful network of survivors of gun violence, and you've probably seen them on television or in newspapers testifying before Congress, and it's a very empowering thing. So we teamed up with Mayors Against Illegal Guns, Mayor Bloomberg's group, a couple of years ago to create a counterweight to the NRA called Everytown for Gun Safety. We advocate for common sense gun laws, things like universal background checks, keeping guns out of sensitive areas like schools and bars, and strengthening domestic violence gun laws. And we also work against gun trafficking, which is particularly important in urban areas. We're modeled after Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and we know that changes to laws aren't enough. For example, Mothers Against Drunk Driving worked very hard to redefine driving under the influence. That was an important part of their mission. But they worked equally hard to change the culture so that we had designated drivers and that people took responsibility for their choices. So we are trying to change the culture as well as the laws. So as Andrea and Kelly mentioned, the gun violence prevention movement and the reproductive justice movement share many key values. I'm going to focus on a few of them today. Specifically, I'm going to talk about women's rights, the ability to raise a family in a safe and healthy community, racial justice, and a commitment to public health. First, I'll start with a little bit of background. A staggering 91 Americans are killed every day through gun violence. Many more are injured. About 2/3 of those gun deaths are by suicide, and most of the rest are homicide. America's gun violence problem is way out of line with from other similar nations. As you can see here, Americans are 25 times more likely to be murdered with a gun than people in other peer nations. The difference, clearly, is guns. Specifically, a combination of incredibly lax gun laws and a culture that encourages people to carry guns everywhere and to shoot first and ask questions later. So why is this a women's issue in particular? Well, women in the U.S. are far more likely than their peers to be murdered by a gun. As you can see here, compared to peer nations, the rate is so much higher. 51 women every month are shot by an intimate partner. Why are women so much more vulnerable in America? Well, it's because of guns. Unfortunately, there are abusive partners everywhere, but nowhere else in the world are they so well armed. The presence of a gun makes it 5 times more likely that domestic violence will turn into murder. Our laws simply fail to protect women. For example, someone with a felony conviction of domestic violence is prohibited from purchasing or owning a gun. Many of you are in the legal community, and you can probably already see the loopholes in this provision. What about misdemeanors? After all, domestic violence charges are often pled down. Well, it turns out that some people convicted of a misdemeanor domestic violence charge are prohibited purchasers, but others aren't. So, for example, if your a boyfriend commits an act of domestic violence against you that's a misdemeanor, he does not become a prohibited purchaser. But if your spouse does, he does become a prohibited purchaser. But the problem is that trends have changed, and the majority of acts of violence with guns happen from boyfriends or girlfriends, not from spouses. What about people who have not yet been convicted of domestic violence? As many of you know, the most dangerous time for an abused woman is just after she leaves her partner. But federal law does not prohibit abusers under temporary restraining orders from purchasing or owning guns. Neither do the vast majority of states. So abusers stay armed at the most volatile time. What about people who already own guns, who aren't trying to purchase a new gun? Even if an abuser is prohibited from purchasing or owning a gun, there are not sufficient safeguards to ensure that they surrender the guns they already have. This is a matter left up to states and local jurisdictions, and frankly, they're not doing a very good job. What about people who evade the background check system altogether? Estimates show that up to 40% of gun purchasers do just that. And you better believe that prohibited purchasers know about the huge loopholes in our system and exploit them. Finally, what about stalkers? Stalkers pose a particular risk to women, and the federal law is silent on them. And in most states, as you can see in this slide, it's perfectly legal for stalkers to buy and own guns. The good news is that we're working really hard to close these loopholes, and we're making progress, even in red states. Believe it or not, the NRA itself has backed off on its opposition to the most common sense improvements on domestic violence laws. This is an area where we hope to continue to improve things at the state level, even in this very, very tough political environment. Before we move on to women's rights, though, I just want to say one more thing about women and gun culture, because there's a lot of overlap here with the reproductive rights movement. There is no question that the most rabid gun rights supporters are part of the cult of toxic masculinity. Women who speak out about gun violence face a vile and threatening response. I'm fairly insulated from this myself, living in Washington, D.C., though I see plenty of it on social media. It's sexist, it's threatening, and it's meant to silence us. Our activists around the country face death threats, threats to their families, and threats of sexual violence. Opponents share their personal information online and harass them. Armed men stalk their organizing meetings, even when children are present. And that's perfectly legal in many parts of the country. But we're not going to shut up. We're brave, and we're determined to do everything we can to protect our families. So that's another value that our movements share, a commitment to raising our families in safe and healthy communities. As I mentioned, we're a very diverse movement that includes men and women, parents and non-parents. But we embrace this mom's brand to invoke the fierce passion that we have for protecting children, whether they're our own children or children more broadly. But unfortunately, America is letting us down. School shootings have become sadly commonplace. Over 200 school shootings since 2013 after Sandy Hook. Though many Americans never even heard the term school and shooting together until Columbine, many of us know that schools have been unsafe for many children long before then. I went to Detroit Public Schools in the 1980s, where we had metal detectors and lockdowns. Not lockdown drills, but actual lockdowns, before this became common practice across the country. This kind of violence threatens not just children's lives and safety, but also their development and education. And it's plagued children of color for a long time before Columbine, or Newtown. Another particular threat to children is unintentional shootings. And by the way, we never say accidental because we don't think they're an accident. They're in most cases preventable. These accidental shootings happen every week in America. Most commonly, both the victim and the shooter are under 5 years old. I'm going to talk a little more about what we can do to prevent unintentional shootings when I discuss gun violence from a public health perspective. But for now, I'd like to move on to racial justice. Another commitment we share with the reproductive justice movement is a commitment to racial justice. Many people don't think much about gun violence unless there's a mass shooting, because that's when the media covers it. But mass shootings, while all too common, are atypical and don't really reflect the everyday toll of gun violence in America. Communities of color are all too aware of gun violence and have been for decades before any Newtown or any of the other galvanizing tragedies. Gun violence affects every American, but it manifests itself in different ways in different communities. For women, as I mentioned, the primary risk is domestic violence. For children, unintentional shootings. For white men, it's suicide, and this too is largely hidden from view. For people of color, and particularly for African American men, as you can see here, it's homicide. The fact is, a heavily armed population, plus a shoot first, ask questions later culture, among both civilians and law enforcement, disproportionately hurts people of color. As our founder, Shannon Watts, said this summer in the wake of another round of police shootings, gun violence is gun violence is gun violence. The mothers of the movement many of you saw on the campaign trail included many gun violence prevention activists, including Moms Demand Action's own national spokeswoman, Lucy McBath, whose son Jordan Davis was murdered in the infamous loud music trial in Florida. And his murderer unsuccessfully invoked the Stand Your Ground law in Florida. Here's something that Lucy told her son just before his tragic death. Baby, there are people in this country that do not value you as a young black male, that don't value young black men in this country. And gun violence is certainly part of that. Some ways that we would like to address this problem in particular is by opposing Stand Your Ground laws. And we also recently issued a report on urban gun violence in particular. And so some of the recommendations that we made are for local law enforcement to use data more effectively to get to the root of the problem. So for example, using gun trace data to track down bad apple dealers and black market sources and stop the flow of guns into urban communities. Another thing is to leave fewer crimes unsolved. For one thing, often someone who is going to commit an act of murder might have committed another crime first. And also, acts of gun violence are often retaliatory. And if we can solve one murder, we may be preventing another. Finally, we can identify at-risk individuals and work to break the cycle of violence with things like cognitive behavioral therapy, conflict resolution, and mentorship. They're doing lots of great experiments across the country on this. And now I'd like to turn to public health. Like reproductive justice, gun violence is a public health issue. Healthcare professionals are on the front lines of America's gun violence problem. ER doctors see the toll in the emergency room. Mental health professionals often see a suicide risk but can't prevent their patients from accessing the most lethal means. Pediatricians, who in many states are muzzled from asking parents about guns, are unable to act to keep children safe from one of the biggest risks they face. We all agree that doctors should be able to speak freely with their patients and their families about their health and safety. But laws in many states prevent this. And there's a lot of overlap between gun gag laws and bias counseling laws, as shown in this map. The results are deadly. If doctors and medical professionals are free to counsel patients about safe storage, they can help prevent both unintentional shootings and suicides. But in far too many cases, safe storage could save lives, as shown in this slide. In 70% of unintentional shootings, we could have prevented them with safe storage. At Moms Demand Action, we have a campaign to reach gun owners and parents directly about safe storage. It's called Be Smart, and it's intended to address both unintentional shootings by children and suicides by teens. Another public health problem is the lack of research on gun violence. This is very much by design. In 1996, the so-called Dickey Amendment, backed by the NRA, stripped the CDC of its funding for gun violence research and forbade the agency from spending its money on anything that was seen to advance the cause of gun control. This had a chilling effect that spread all over the government and to universities, which rely on the federal government for research funds. It dried up the funds we needed to build the evidence base we need. It means we don't know as much as we should about the scale of the problem, its causes, and how to prevent gun violence. Thankfully, private funders such as Mayor Bloomberg have helped to make up some of the gap. This session, Congress tried to reverse the ban but failed, and President Obama attempted to at least lessen it through executive order, although that certainly looks like something that will likely be reversed in the new administration. Even Congressman Dickey himself has come out against the provision, but still it stands. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about our agenda. Our number one goal is universal background checks. The vast majority of Americans are on our side, including the majority of Republicans and even the majority of NRA members. Background checks work. Since 1993, when the Brady Bill was passed, checks have blocked nearly 3 million gun sales to prohibited purchasers. Research shows that background checks reduce every form of gun violence, but there are way too many loopholes. Federal law applies only to federally licensed dealers, and estimates show that up to 40% of gun sales avoid background checks. We used to call this the gun show loophole, because while you would have to submit to a check at a national retailer like Walmart, at a gun show you'd have the choice between a federally licensed seller at one booth and one who specifically advertised being a so-called private seller in the next booth or in the parking lot. And they often advertise specifically saying you could avoid a background check by buying from them, even if they sold a huge volume of guns. Over time, many of these so-called private sales moved online to sites like Arms List, which is basically the Craigslist of guns. One reason that we pursue background checks is because it's just good common sense. If we've agreed as a society that certain people are too dangerous to buy or own guns, and that list includes felons, domestic abusers, and people with mental illnesses so severe they've been adjudicated to be dangerous to themselves or others, then we should actually check to see if they meet one of those criteria before we sell them a gun. It's also politically potent. It doesn't affect law-abiding gun owners. The system is called the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS, and it's called instant for a reason. It just takes a couple of minutes at the point of purchase. We're not taking away anyone's guns, and we're not regulating the guns themselves, but instead defining who is safe to buy and own guns. Obviously, the results of the presidential and congressional elections are a huge setback on the federal level, and our federal agenda is now primarily defensive. Donald Trump on the campaign trail outlined a very dangerous agenda, and he was well funded by the NRA. In fact, the NRA was his biggest outside funder. As you can see in this slide, he promised on the first day to overturn all of Obama's executive actions on day one, and also said he'd mandate back the end of gun-free zones in every school and military base. Now, he can't do that on day one. It's going to take more effort, and certainly the rules regarding schools are not federally mandated. But the NRA has a very dangerous wish list, and the number one thing that we're concerned about is something called federally mandated concealed carry reciprocity, which basically means if you can get a permit somewhere, you can carry your gun anywhere. So in Florida, where there's basically no criteria to get a permit, someone could get a permit and then carry a gun here in Washington, D.C., where I live, a very sensitive place, the seat of our federal government, where we justifiably have stricter standards about who can carry a hidden loaded weapon around our city. So the federal outlook is pretty grim, but we plan to fight back with everything that we have, and we also see a lot of hope at the state level. Last Tuesday, Nevada became the 20th state, in addition to D.C., to expand background checks. We won 3 out of 4 state referenda on guns last Tuesday as well. Our next goal at the state level is passing universal background checks in New Mexico, where we worked really hard to flip the state legislature and succeeded. We're doing this state by state, and we're getting closer to our goal of universal background checks. We're also going to work really hard at the state level on both offense, for example, on domestic violence laws, and on defense, for example, trying to keep guns off of college campuses, bars, and other sensitive places. We've been doing that for the last 4 years, and we continue to come back just as hard. Now, finally, what can you do? Many people, particularly over the past week, have asked me what they can do to get more involved. There's a hunger to organize and to fight back, and it's very important. And you know, as Andrea and Kelly mentioned, all of our movements are deeply intertwined, and I think that fighting back on any of these fronts is going to help us defeat the dangerous Trump agenda. So I've listed some important steps on gun violence prevention here, and I'm just going to highlight 2 of them. One you can do right now, join Moms Demand Action. And remember, you don't have to be a mom to do it. Just text JOIN to 64433 and you'll be all set. And second, I just want to talk to you about a particularly potent thing that we do. It's called the Gun Sense Action Network. And what we do is we call or text into each week 2 constituents in a key state, whatever state we're targeting that week. So it could be a state legislative priority or a federal legislative priority. And we brief the person we talk to on the issue that we're talking about, and then we patch them directly to their legislators so that they can talk. And you know, calling your legislator is the most important way that you can get them to listen to your concerns. And so this is a very, very potent way, and we've had some major victories using this Gun Sense Action Network. The most notable for me is in Georgia, where the state legislature decided to impose campus carry on all university campuses in the state above the objections of the university presidents. Well, we worked very, very, very hard lobbying the governor and flooding him with calls, and their Republican governor vetoed the bill and said that he would not force campus carry on these colleges and universities. So I think, you know, this is an hour a week that you can spend on something that can be really potent in a time when we have a very dangerous agenda to contend with. And in closing, I just want to reiterate how glad I am that we're in this together. More than ever, it's clear that we all need to stick together, and it reassures me to know that we're fighting side by side. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. And now we'll be going into Dion McGill's presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you to If, When, How. And yes, so I'm going to kind of offer something a little different. Kathleen's information was amazing. I don't think I could add anything more as far as legislative information, because much of what the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence does is similar to what Moms Demand Action do, but we just simply do it at the statewide level. So I'm actually going to be talking and offering my perspective a little differently as what it's like to be an educator in the gun violence prevention movement and who works directly with children. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about what I actually do here at the ICHV and kind of how that links with this idea of reproductive justice. There we go. So here, I'm sorry. This is my overview slide. You can tell I'm a teacher because I always include an overview slide in my presentations. So the Student Voices program here at the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, it basically breaks down into 3 different parts. So the first part is the Student Voices contest, and that was our first entry into the education world. And it's basically a contest where students, the idea was to get students to present their ideas, get their voices on this conversation instead of a group of adults who are always talking about children. And then from there, we expanded our education into doing workshops, and I always call those just our violence is violence offerings because they can range from everything from bullying to violence in the media and how students are processing it and critical thinking skills and moving all the way up to actually having workshops specifically about gun violence and community activism and those topics. And then our biggest program and kind of the focal point of my work here is the Activist Institute. And kind of like that was said in the introduction, basically what I do is I go into elementary, middle schools, and high schools, and I teach students methods of advocacy and activism that they can use in their schools and communities. That can look different from school to school, and it looks different from classroom to classroom just based on the interests and aptitudes of the students. However, the final point of the Activist Institute is to teach these skills and then have the students do a campaign. So I'm going to very briefly just kind of highlight one of the campaigns we did so you can have a more concrete idea of the work I do. Last school year, I was working at Henderson Elementary School. Henderson Elementary is in the West Englewood neighborhood here of Chicago. Inglewood right now and West Inglewood are statistically the second most dangerous neighborhoods in the city. They undergo a lot of shootings. So while working in Henderson last year, Henderson had the unfortunate incident of having an 8th grader shot and killed. He'd been a student at the school for 10 days. He'd actually been in Chicago for 11 days. And the 10th day he was here in the city, he was shot and killed. Following that, that was in November. In February, a 3-year-old was shot in front of the school on a Saturday afternoon. So following that event, I was in the school on the following Tuesday, and I said, we cannot act like this didn't happen, so what are we going to do, which is always my driving question for the Activist Institute. What can we do today? And that started a series of conversations that eventually led to the students wanting to have some kind of peace rally. And then from there, the idea expanded to have a peace march. And so we ended up having a peace march about a month later. It was very well attended. Every media outlet pretty much in the city was there. Their alderman came, the police commander, their state representative sent someone to come. The community members, most importantly, came out, parents, and the entire school. So that's the kind of things that we try to facilitate through the Activist Institute. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about my perspective working directly with the kids and the impacts I see. But just real quick, I wanted to kind of give a little brief overview of gun violence from the perspective of the ICHV and so on and so forth. So nationally, this is kind of, you can see on your screen, last year 13,286 people were killed by firearms in the U.S. I mean, I think that number speaks for itself. Beyond that, there were 372 mass shootings, and those mass shootings killed 475 people. And there were also 64 school shootings. So I think those numbers kind of speak for themselves as to the problem we're facing with gun violence. From there, more specifically, here in Illinois and in Chicago, Illinois has about 1,000 people shot and killed every year, and the majority of those shootings and killings come from Chicago. So I took these statistics from this morning. You'll see in my last slide, these statistics are actually from a website called heyjackass.com, which is actually, here in Chicago, one of the most accurate statistical websites for gun violence in the city. So you can see on your left there what the week in progress this week looks like. I think if I updated those numbers. And then you can see what November so far here in the city. We've had 42 total homicides, 39 of those gun-related. And then this year, you can see that so far we've had 695 homicides, with 622 of those being gun-related. Here in Chicago, if you are a homicide victim, there's an 89.8% chance that that homicide be performed with a gun. And then 5.4% are stabbing, and then 4% is everything else. And here in Chicago, I grew up in Chicago. I grew up on the south side of the city in the Roseland neighborhood. Roseland is also known as the Wild Hunnets. That's its nickname. So you can give you an idea of what the neighborhood is like. And that's kind of since I was a kid. And so here in Chicago, I always feel like gun violence is one of those issues that cannot be separated from conversations of race and economy, because they're here in Chicago very specifically are very interrelated. And you can see this, that if you're a victim of gun violence here in the city, 77.9% of those victims are black, 16.6% being Hispanic. And then a majority of the time, we know that usually the perpetrators of violence do mirror their victims. So while statistically 80.2% of the assailants are unknown, we know that that number is much higher as far as the perpetrators also being black. And here in Chicago, this gun violence problem very specifically hits very specific neighborhoods. So you are looking at the west side of the city and the south side of the city. So that also is to be taken in consideration. And for anyone who's interested, I included this slide and this information. This is the teacher in me coming out. This American Life, which is a podcast and radio show, did a very good 3-part episode about Harper High School here in Chicago. Harper is a public school in the south side of Chicago, and in one school year, which was 2012, they had 29 students shot. 8 of them were fatal, and 21 were simply wounded. And this was all in one academic year. So This American Life went in and spent 5 months at Harper in the 2013 school year, as the school was basically picking up the pieces of that. In addition, this book, How Long Will I Cry, is actually a book I'm reading right now. You can get it actually 100% for free. All you have to do is go onto the Big Shoulder Press website. It's 100% free to buy, and it's actually free shipping as well. So I encourage you to check out both of these, and you can get very clear pictures from first-person perspective of what gun violence is like for the youth here in the city, here in their voices, which is what here our education programs are really all about, trying to get the student voices on the conversation and getting people to see and hear those voices. And kind of going along with this idea of the racial disparities in gun violence, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, according to their statistics, homicide was the #1 killer of black men between the ages of 15 and 24, going back as far as 2011. That's remained the same in 2013, although we don't have 2015 numbers. It's a safe assumption to believe that that has not changed at all. And I stuck this in here so you can kind of see for yourselves how this kind of stacks up. So these are the demographic of black males across age ranges and the ranking of causes of death. So you can see here that the homicide hits the 15 to 34 age group as the #1 cause of death. Then you can jump down to 10-year-olds in that second rank, and then it also ranks #3 in some of the age groups and so forth. But when you compare this to the exact same age groups but simply changing the race, if you can see there, homicide does not come up until ranked #3, and that's also in that 15 to 24 age group. And also, if you can look up to the second rank here at 15 to 34, suicide is a high-ranking thing in this racial group, and that's important because Chicago is a little unique in the fact that when we talk about gun violence here, that gun violence is usually gang-related, drug-related, those type, what we would consider street crime. But nationally, 60% of the gun violence that we actually see nationally is suicide. And I don't know if it was mentioned before in the introduction, I am a veteran. I spent 9 years in the Army. One of those years I spent in Afghanistan, so I'm very well aware of the issue of PTSD and veteran suicide. I actually had a close friend of mine commit suicide last year with a handgun in the parking lot of the VA hospital where she was going for therapy. So that's also another aspect of the gun violence issue that isn't often discussed and we don't often see in the media, but is also there. And suicide is the second most common cause of death for Americans nationally between ages of 15 and 24. And 39,000 people die by suicide in the U.S. every year. 51% of those being firearms, and predominantly those also tend to be male. Men commit suicide with a gun more often than women. So switching a little bit to the idea of gun violence as a public health issue. I stuck this here. I do apologize for the text-heavy slide here, but this is actually a direct quote from the CDC website, and this is also a poster if you recall or have seen these posters or recall seeing these posters. I stuck this in here because this quote very much shows how instrumental the CDC was in decreasing vehicular deaths here in the United States. And unfortunately, and as Kathleen mentioned, the CDC is not able to do the same research on gun violence as they were on cars and car death. And so because of that, we don't necessarily have the empirical evidence to talk about the exact causes of gun violence and what the best way to approach as a solution is, at least not from an extremely well-respected organization like the CDC. If they were able to do research, we would have some very concrete answers, some very concrete suggestions, and we'd have some very concrete ways to move. I think that would would provide a little more a push at a national level. So that's something to keep in mind. And as Kathleen mentioned, the Dickey Amendment had a lot to do with that. And if you're not familiar with that amendment, definitely check it out and do a little research on it, do some reading on it. So I want to pivot once again. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts of gun violence on youth and communities. And I'm just going to kind of fill in a little anecdotal evidence of what I've seen as a teacher working in schools here in the South Side and West Side of Chicago. So here you'll have a list of the impacts of gun violence. If you do a little reading, if you're familiar with psychology, so on and so forth, these are young people who've endured trauma. These are pretty standard impacts. And when you're dealing with this idea of gun violence, I see this all the time with children feeling at risk, children who have a sense of hopelessness. One thing that really alarms me, and I see this also, and I should say seen this with veterans, is the desensitization to violence. It doesn't affect them. A perfect example is we were talking with a young lady the other day, and she goes, there was a shooting on my corner the other night. I go, what happened? And she explained it to me. I said, what did you do? She goes, well, I got out on the floor, and they were shooting for a little bit, and it was over. And I'm like, okay. And then what happened? And she goes, that's it. I go, does this happen on your block a lot? She goes, every once in a while. And her matter-of-fact reaction to a shootout on her street paints a perfect picture for me of how she's being impacted by gun violence. And then sometimes you have students who feel like they have to carry a gun to feel safe, to be safe. And then unfortunately, that overwhelming sense of needing guns to be safe begins to shape the community. And I've been to communities where I'll ask the kids, 7th graders, 8th graders, how many of you know someone your age who has a gun? And most hands in the room will go up. And going on from there. And then we also know that students who've been exposed to chronic trauma can experience inhibited brain development. You also have issues with concentration. You also can have problems with violence and aggression. And unfortunately, sometimes the students don't develop the nonviolent conflict resolution skills that other students may receive in other communities. And so you kind of get almost like a loop where the violence is feeding into itself, and these students are kind of caught in the middle of that. And I see that all the time. So going from there, you have to keep in mind also, I think this is very important, is that when you're talking about these impacts of gun violence, the sleep disturbances, the difficulty concentrating, which I see a lot of, the declines in academic performance. You're not talking in a community such as Inglewood here on the south side of the city. You're not talking about 2 or 3 students dealing with this. You're talking about the entire class because they all live in this community. And in this community, there are shootings going on every day. And for example, the last day in Chicago without a shooting was February 28th of 2015. So since February 28th of 2015, Chicago has had a shooting every day since then. And so far this year, we've had 51 days without homicides, but we haven't had a day without a shooting. So those shootings primarily occur, like I said, on the south and west side. So these students are enduring this every day, and you're seeing these impacts grow. And then you finally end up with what the students, what I refer to, what doctors refer to as a climate of hopelessness. The kids don't necessarily think about the future. They don't necessarily think about college. It's very hard to get a kid to concentrate in class when he's thinking about having lost a friend, having lost an uncle, having a father shot, all of which I've seen in my 2 years working here at the ICHV. I've dealt with all those situations independently. And also as an impact, eventually you start to see basically what would be the symptoms of PTSD. And a perfect example of this, if you are familiar with the book There Are No Children Here, which was written by Alex Kotlowitz, if you've never read it, I highly recommend it. Alex was able to take a snapshot of 2 young men who lived in a neighborhood in the city of Chicago, and you start to see how their lives are being developed, living through this chronic trauma and constant violence. And you start to see the hypervigilance, the nightmares, the flashbacks, kids who either see a friend killed or are with a friend when he is killed often can go through the survivor guilt, and then it definitely impacts their personal relationships with friends and families. You see a lot of withdrawal. You hear a lot of times from kids, you try to talk with them, no one understands, no one gets it, especially if you speak with a student who's actually been shot. And it's hard to say, oh, I'm going to understand, because me personally, even having been in the military, I've never been shot. I don't know what that's like. And it's very hard to try to get that child to open up. And then, and kind of going back to what I said earlier, all of this is exacerbated by the idea that these communities that are most inflicted by gun violence here in Chicago are also the communities with the lowest median incomes. They're also the communities that had 50 schools closed within the last 2 years. And so those students often deal with inadequate diets. They often live in food deserts. And they often live in homes that have, for one reason or another, limited parental oversight. And you see here, I put the Cornell Park incident. So recently I was working in a school named Sawyer Elementary School, and the soccer team was at Cornell Park. Cornell Park is a park in the back of the yards area of Chicago. They were on site for a shooting. Basically a shootout between 3 gentlemen occurred in the park during their soccer game. And the referee served to get all the kids on the ground and start to make sure that they were staying low while the shooting was occurring. And then the coaches and the referees got all the students off site as quick as possible, called parents and buses to get the students evacuated. So one of the soccer students was in one of my sessions, and we were discussing this. And I said, well, what happened? He explained the situation. He goes, my mom came and picked me up. I said, did you discuss this with her, and what were her thoughts on this? He goes, no. He goes, she picked me up and took me home, but she had to go back to work. And it was a reminder to me, and I have to be reminded of this a lot, that these students also live in households oftentimes where they're left to their own devices, not because there isn't a caring parent in the home, but because the parents are working sometimes 2 or 3 jobs. And so if both parents are working pretty much day and night, the students may see the parents literally right before bedtime, and the parents sometimes are often out of the home when the student wakes up. And I hear these stories all the time from the kids that I work with. And I just want to explicitly kind of state this overlap of gun violence and reproductive justice. I took this quote from the If, When, How website, and I think you can very clearly see, especially with the last words here, the families that I often come in contact with and that I often deal with in my role, they don't have the freedom to raise, the parents don't have the freedom to raise their children in environments that are free of violence. And it becomes hard for them to be parents in a lot of situations, and it becomes hard for the children to remain children for one reason or another. And I often come in contact with students who do raise their younger brothers and sisters because the parents are working, and then on top of that, they're dealing with this constant threat of violence that's just dominating their world. So you have that there. So action items. This is something I often say with my students. We often talk about the idea of educating, advocating, and then activating people. So what I would say for everyone who wants to get involved in this specific issue of gun violence, and obviously how it impacts reproductive justice. First, you got to educate yourself. I included 2 films here. I think they're good introductions to the gun violence prevention movement, and it gives you great backgrounds. One of those is the film Making a Killing, and then the other is the Under the Gun. Those are 2 films that definitely kind of give you broad overviews of the gun violence issue, dealing with just street violence, dealing with suicide, dealing with domestic violence, which is a huge issue. And then from there, once you educate yourself, I always tell you, you have to start advocating. You have to tell your friends. So that can, you know, if you watch this movie, pass that movie on to a friend. Don't be afraid to invite friends over and bring up, you know, what do you guys think about this issue? Have teas or coffees that where the specific point of discussion will be gun violence. Have movie showings in your home. Have book readings in your home. How Long Will I Cry is an amazing book to read because it's based on interviews with victims, educators, activists in the gun violence movement, and their direct interviews where they're talking about their personal perspective on the issue, whether they're a victim, whether they're a survivor, or whether it's an issue that they work on in one way or another. Also, after that, once you've advocated, you've educated, you have to start activating. And that for me means you are directly doing something that is working to change the flow of gun violence in America. And that could be anything from contacting your elected officials. What are their stances on these issues? How do they feel? How do they vote? Are they receiving money from organizations like the NRA that often work against what we're working towards? Volunteering, donating, petitioning, phone banking. I'm sure Kathleen has done all of these things as well. Slipping bills when they come up in the legislative houses. And if you're more of a social media person, there are also applications that work towards this end, like Countable and iCitizen. So, and those are actually applications that I use with my students and use in discussion for the younger kids because they're so social media minded and they want to work on their phone with something. So you can also look up bills, see who voted on a particular bill, how they voted using those apps as well. And so, in final, these are the sources I use. If you post this webinar, I know they're going to make this available, so I want to be sure to include this information so that everyone can have it. And this is finally, here's my contact info, which I believe will also be offered by If, When, and How. So you have that. So thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you to our speakers today. At this time, if you have a question, please type one into our chat function and we'll make sure it gets answered. As a reminder, we are recording today's webinar and we'll send the webinar recording and slides around to everyone within the next few days. So we have one question from Eleanor Foreman who's asking what Hey Jack that URL is, Dion.
Oh, the URL for Hey Jackass?
Yes.
I apologize. So Hey Jackass is it's the URL is just heyjackass.com. It's a website that kind of popped up a few years ago, and it is extremely accurate dealing with gun violence here in Chicago. Almost any statistic you can want to know about gun violence in Chicago, unintentional shootings, they keep track of where people are shot, the sex, time, location. It's absolutely amazing. And actually, I wrote them yesterday asking when was the last day we did not have a shooting in Chicago, and they sent that information to me. And they also sent me the information on how many days we've had this year without homicides. And so it's an amazing website, and I was a little hesitant to use it, but actually newspapers here in the city make reference to it as well. So it's a very legitimate website.
We have another question. Given expected increase in violence toward abortion providers, any initiative to prevent violence from gun control standpoint?
Hi, this is Kelly. I mean, I think we have continued and ongoing concerns around violence for abortion providers, and there are various state and federal laws that do protect abortion providers, as well as state laws and state bills that we've been that advocates are thinking about pushing to provide, free spaces where providers are safe and the people trying to get to their clinics are safe. Dion and Kathleen, I will say I haven't thought of this from a gun control perspective, so I don't know if you have thoughts on specifically on how some of the gun control efforts could affect safety for abortion providers. I mean, off the top of my head, I'm thinking this speaks to the importance of background checks.
Yeah, Kelly, I would agree with that, keeping guns out of the hands of the most dangerous people, really helps all forms of gun violence. And I think it also goes to the fact that I mentioned earlier, the laws are only as good as the enforcement. And so like with domestic violence, it's similar, that, you can have great laws, but if you're not enforcing them well on the local level, then you're not keeping people safe.
Thanks. Gamhee, I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, we have one question. What do the statistics look like without suicide, which is not murder or unintentional?
32 gun deaths a day, homicides, I'm sorry, 32 gun homicides a day.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. I think those are all the questions we have time for today. It was a really great presentation. Thank you so much again to our speakers. Please feel free to email us any questions we didn't answer, and we'll make sure to send you a response within a few days. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kelly to close.
Yes, thank you, Gamhee, and thank you, Andrea, Kathleen, and Dion for speaking on this webinar. It was really wonderful, and thanks to everybody who attended the webinar. Thank you, Lena. And this is the end of the 2016 webinar series, but please keep your eye out next year when we announce the new series. And as I said, let us know if you have any thoughts on or topics that you would like to see from us. Thank you.